When someone adopts a pattern of excessive friendliness, often rooted in people-pleasing behavior, the biological cost is not just emotional, it's physiological. At the core of this reaction is the autonomic nervous system, specifically its two main branches: the sympathetic nervous system, which mobilizes the body in response to perceived threat, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which supports calm, digestion, and recovery. When an individual is overly agreeable or too friendly in situations that warrant assertiveness or boundary setting, they are not acting from a place of true safety or calm. Rather, they are activating a less discussed but deeply ingrained response known as the fawn response. This is a state in which an individual attempts to diffuse conflict or threat by becoming overly accommodating, excessively helpful, or submissive. While it may appear socially acceptable on the surface, it is, in fact, a stress response driven by the nervous system's desire to maintain safety at all costs. The fawn response, like fight, flight, or freeze, is an evolutionary mechanism that evolved to keep us alive in social hierarchies. When the brain detects a power imbalance, rejection risk, or subtle threat of disapproval, it may activate this mode to avoid confrontation. In people who were raised in environments where directness or emotional expression led to punishment, withdrawal, or shame, this neural pathway becomes deeply grooved into the brain's circuitry. Over time, the nervous system begins to perceive even mild interpersonal tension as a cue to suppress one's truth and perform friendliness instead. This performance may look like smiling during discomfort, saying yes when internally you mean no, or trying to make everyone else comfortable at the expense of your own well-being. This pattern has a compounding effect on the autonomic nervous system. The body is not simply being nice, it's working overtime to manage stress while simultaneously suppressing emotional honesty. The sympathetic nervous system is partially activated, enough to create internal tension and anxiety, but is held back from full mobilization due to social constraint. This leads to what's called autonomic fragmentation, a state where the body is both activated and repressed at the same time. The vagus nerve, a major player in parasympathetic regulation, becomes dysregulated. Instead of supporting calm and recovery, it becomes associated with social masking and performance under stress. The body doesn't return to baseline after the interaction. It stays in a low-grade stress loop, often unnoticed consciously, but deeply felt physiologically. Over time, this dysregulation manifests in many ways. There is a buildup of somatic tension, tightness in the jaw, shoulders, chest, and gut. Sleep becomes compromised, not always from anxiety before bed, but because the nervous system has been living in a performative state throughout the day and hasn't had true moments of recovery. Even digestion can be affected, since the parasympathetic system governs processes like nutrient absorption and gut motility. Chronic friendliness becomes a hidden drain on the body's energy systems. You're not exhausted because you've been busy. You're exhausted because your biology has been in self-protection mode all day, disguised as kindness. This dysregulation also creates long-term neural consequences. The brain begins to encode friendliness with safety and assertiveness with danger. This rewiring makes future boundary setting feel neurologically unsafe. The prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision-making and social judgment, begins to override somatic signals of discomfort to maintain approval from others. This is especially dangerous because it creates cognitive dissonance. The body signals discomfort, but the mind justifies the behavior as necessary or polite. Over time, this disconnect leads to burnout, resentment, and sometimes even identity confusion. The individual loses touch with their own internal compass because their nervous system has been trained to prioritize relational smoothness over internal truth. It's critical to understand that this isn't a matter of personality or morality. It's a matter of neurobiology. The more a person defaults to excessive friendliness under stress, the more this pattern becomes entrenched as a survival strategy. Neuroplasticity ensures that frequently used circuits become stronger and faster, which means that people who habitually use friendliness to navigate discomfort are biologically more likely to do it again in the future. This hardwires submissive behaviors into the brain's stress response system, making it increasingly difficult to act from a place of authentic calm or confidence. When someone consistently engages in excessive friendliness, especially as a strategy for maintaining social approval, what is often occurring beneath the surface is a repeated hijacking of the brain's dopamine system. Dopamine, often misunderstood as the pleasure chemical, is more accurately described as the neurotransmitter of motivation and anticipation. It plays a central role in reinforcing behaviors that the brain deems valuable for survival or reward. In a healthy system, dopamine surges in response to progress toward meaningful goals, skill acquisition, or overcoming challenges. But in the context of chronic people-pleasing or social over-accommodation, dopamine is no longer linked to internal mastery. Instead, it becomes tethered to the reactions and approval of others, creating a fragile and externally sourced reward loop. This creates a dependency on what neuroscientists call social dopamine hits. Each time someone validates you, praises you, or simply doesn't reject you after you've overextended your friendliness, your brain registers a dopamine release. That chemical response becomes positively reinforcing the behavior. Over-agreeing, suppressing your needs, smiling through discomfort gets coded as something that leads to a reward. Over time, your brain doesn't just hope for approval, it expects it. And when that approval doesn't come, the absence of dopamine creates a subtle withdrawal-like response. Anxiety, insecurity, and a compulsive need to fix the interaction or make others comfortable again. What was once a conscious choice becomes an addictive behavioral loop, neurologically reinforced through repetition and chemical reward. At the level of circuitry, this shifts motivational pathways from intrinsic to extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation is when your behavior is driven by internal values, curiosity, or purpose. It activates deep networks in the prefrontal cortex and striatum that support long-term planning and identity. Extrinsic motivation, on the other hand, is driven by outcomes like praise, attention, or acceptance. When friendliness becomes a means to chase extrinsic approval, the brain deprioritizes self-respect and replaces it with approval seeking. Dopamine neurons begin to fire in anticipation of how others will respond, not in response to whether your actions align with your core values or needs. This shift has consequences. Over time, the reward circuitry in the brain, particularly the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, begins to atrophy when it isn't fueled by internally meaningful action. You feel empty after interactions that appear socially successful. You wonder why being liked doesn't feel like enough. This is because the dopamine that arises from external validation is short-lived and surface level. It lacks the depth and integration of dopamine that comes from accomplishing something hard, standing in your truth, or making decisions that align with your internal compass. The brain knows the difference between dopamine generated from authenticity and dopamine generated from performance. One sustains you, the other depletes you. Additionally, this constant reach for external dopamine erodes self-trust. The brain begins to reference others for behavioral cues rather than referencing internal sensations or beliefs. This becomes particularly dangerous in situations that require conflict, clarity, or leadership. Instead of asking what feels right in this situation, the dopamine-addicted brain asks, what will make them approve of me? This external orientation weakens the executive control networks in the brain that are essential for emotional regulation, boundary setting, and long-term decision-making. Over time, the very structure of your self-perception shifts, not because you've changed, but because your neurochemistry has been trained to prioritize acceptance over authenticity. What often emerges from this cycle is not just burnout or exhaustion, but emotional confusion. You may find yourself unable to explain why you're so drained after social situations where you were kind, pleasant, and liked. But the drain is biochemical. Each act of inauthentic friendliness costs dopamine and fails to replenish it with true internal reward. The result is a cycle of performance and emptiness. The nervous system keeps pushing for connection, but the connections are shallow because they are built on performative cues rather than genuine engagement. The more you rely on friendliness as a tool for regulation and reward, the more distorted your internal signals become. You may lose the ability to discern when you're acting from truth or from the need to avoid disapproval. And because the dopamine system is malleable through neuroplasticity, every time you reinforce this external validation loop, the brain becomes more efficient at executing it and more resistant to alternatives. The basal ganglia, the region responsible for habit formation, begins to encode social approval as the ultimate goal of interaction. This means that any behavior that risks rejection, even if it's authentic, is subconsciously marked as a threat to your neurochemical stability. The cost of authenticity then feels higher than the cost of self-suppression. And in this way, excessive friendliness becomes a chemically enforced identity, one that robs the brain of the deeper satisfaction it could achieve by aligning action with internal truth rather than external reward. Excessive friendliness often stems from a deep unconscious pattern of over-attunement to others. At the core of this neurological behavior is the mirror neuron system, a set of brain circuits that allow humans to simulate the mental and emotional states of others. These neurons fire both when you perform an action and when you observe someone else performing the same action. In essence, they are designed to help the brain mirror what it sees, enabling empathy, learning through imitation, and coordinated social interaction. However, in individuals who are chronically too friendly, meaning they suppress their own needs, opinions, or discomfort to maintain harmony, this mirror system becomes excessively active and dominant, often at the expense of identity formation and self-expression. When the brain is continually focused on the feelings and expectations of others, the mirror neurons remain hyper-engaged. This means the nervous system spends an unusual amount of energy trying to predict how someone else might react, how to make them comfortable, or how to avoid their disappointment or disapproval. The person becomes neurologically wired for reflection rather than assertion. Instead of originating thoughts, they echo them. Instead of setting emotional tones, they absorb them. Over time, this behavior becomes not just habitual, but deeply embodied. The body tenses in the presence of potential disapproval. The face automatically smiles to appease, and the voice softens or raises to match perceived social expectations. The individual becomes a social chameleon, trained by their brain to mirror everyone but themselves. This can be traced back to early developmental patterns. For individuals raised in environments where emotional expression was risky or where love was conditional upon behavior, the mirror neuron system learned to be on high alert. If a parent was unpredictable, critical, or withdrawn, the child learned to read micro-expressions, tone, and mood changes with extreme sensitivity. That early wiring becomes a survival strategy. Mirror the caregiver's state to avoid rejection or punishment. But the brain doesn't outgrow this just because the body matures. Unless actively reconditioned, that pattern persists into adulthood, shaping how relationships are navigated, how conflict is handled, and how identity is expressed or suppressed. The long-term neurobiological impact of this excessive mirroring is the suppression of what neuroscientists refer to as self-agency. Self-agency is the brain's capacity to initiate action from internal desire, to choose behavior based on one's own beliefs rather than on expected social outcomes. This ability is closely tied to networks in the medial prefrontal cortex, regions responsible for internal narrative, values, and decision-making. When mirror neurons dominate the social landscape of the brain, these self-agency networks are underused, sometimes even stunted. You begin to experience your relationships as performances, your choices as compromises, and your personality as a projection instead of a core. The cost of this imbalance becomes even more evident during emotionally charged situations. When the mirror system is overactive and the self-agency system is underdeveloped, the person becomes emotionally porous. They absorb the moods and tensions of others so thoroughly that their own feelings become muddled or inaccessible. In high-stress environments, this can lead to emotional shutdown as the brain struggles to reconcile its internal needs with the simulated states of others. It's not uncommon for individuals who are excessively friendly to experience chronic inner confusion, difficulty making decisions, and even somatic symptoms like fatigue, migraines, or digestive issues. This is because their nervous system is essentially stuck in a loop of social simulation, unable to return to its own baseline. Additionally, excessive activation of the mirror neuron system without a strong counterbalance from internal regulation networks leads to a decrease in what's called emotional granularity, the ability to recognize and name your own emotional states with specificity. Instead of being able to say, I feel frustrated because my boundary was crossed, a person might simply feel general unease or guilt and then try to resolve it by being even more accommodating. This mislabeling of internal states is not just a psychological issue. It's a result of neural patterns that reinforce external scanning over internal sensing. Eventually, this imbalance can result in the person being well-liked, but rarely known. Relationships become shallow, not because the individual lacks depth, but because they are neurologically conditioned to keep that depth hidden. They reflect what others want to see, and in doing so become strangers to their own needs, limits, and preferences. This lack of congruence between internal truth and external behavior sends subtle signals to the nervous system that things are not aligned. The body keeps score of this misalignment through chronic stress responses, reduced emotional resilience, and a growing sense of disconnection from self. When a person continuously prioritizes being agreeable or overly accommodating, their brain gradually weakens its ability to generate and enforce healthy psychological boundaries. Boundaries are not just moral or social constructs. They are neural events shaped and maintained by distinct regions of the brain that govern self-awareness, emotional regulation, and risk assessment. The insular cortex, for instance, is involved in mapping internal bodily states and detecting when something feels off or unsafe. It helps an individual sense discomfort, unease, or subtle violations of space or respect. In people who are too friendly, this insular feedback is often overridden. The signals are still there, but the prefrontal cortex, particularly in its role as the interpreter of social meaning, may suppress these cues in order to maintain relational peace or avoid confrontation. Over time, this repeated override conditions the brain to misinterpret boundary violations as social obligation. If someone consistently says yes when they mean no, if they agree when they disagree, or if they remain silent in the face of discomfort, the brain learns to associate boundary suppression with safety. This becomes a deeply encoded safety mechanism in the nervous system. Rather than acting on internal discomfort, the individual adapts to it, muting their emotional signals in favor of external harmony. What this does, however, is distort the signal-to-noise ratio in the brain's emotional systems. The signals for discomfort become background noise, and the social cues, facial expressions, approval, tone of voice, become the only messages the brain prioritizes. This imbalance breaks down the person's capacity to draw, enforce, and maintain psychological boundaries in real time. This neurological erosion of boundaries is reinforced by the way the brain responds to short-term relief. Every time a person avoids conflict by being friendly, they experience a reduction in stress hormones like cortisol. This short-term relief is interpreted by the brain as a reward. Even if long-term resentment or exhaustion follows, the brain reinforces the immediate payoff. Neural pathways that link friendliness with relief are strengthened, while those associated with assertiveness or confrontation are weakened. This explains why many overly friendly individuals feel intense anxiety even at the thought of setting a boundary. The brain has linked boundary setting with potential pain, while linking boundary suppression with temporary peace. Over time, this association builds a system where avoiding discomfort becomes more important than protecting self-respect. The anterior cingulate cortex, another region deeply involved in decision-making and emotional processing, becomes a battleground for this internal conflict. It's the part of the brain that detects conflict and errors. It registers when your actions don't align with your inner feelings. For someone who is too friendly, this region is often hyperactive, creating a persistent sense of internal friction. They know they don't want to say yes. They feel the boundaries being crossed, but the action they take contradicts that awareness. This internal dissonance is neurologically expensive. The brain is wired to seek congruence between internal state and external action. And when that congruence is missing repeatedly, it taxes the nervous system. Chronic stress, fatigue, and anxiety can arise simply from the mismatch between what is felt and what is expressed. This pattern doesn't just affect the individual's relationship with others, it impacts their relationship with themselves. When the brain is repeatedly exposed to situations where self-expression is muted in favor of friendliness, it starts to blur the distinction between internal truth and external approval. Over time, people may stop knowing what they actually want. Their preferences become fluid, shaped by whatever makes others more comfortable. This phenomenon is not weakness. It is a reflection of neural plasticity adapting to repeated experiences. The brain becomes what it practices. If it practices boundary suppression daily, the neural architecture supporting strong personal limits begins to weaken. This doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow erosion, one smile at a time, one silence at a time, until the default mode of interaction is no longer authenticity, but performance. Additionally, the absence of boundaries leaves the nervous system in a vulnerable state. When individuals fail to signal their discomfort to others, they unintentionally train those around them to overlook their needs. The social brain, which includes regions like the temporoparietal junction and medial prefrontal cortex, is designed to adjust behavior in response to cues from others. If you never express limits, others have no feedback mechanism to help them regulate their behavior toward you. The result is that people may cross lines not out of malice, but because your brain never sent the appropriate social signals. This lack of feedback turns into a feedback loop, where relational imbalance becomes the norm, not the exception. You begin to feel invisible or misunderstood, but in reality, your nervous system has been muting your boundaries for so long that others no longer perceive where they are. Chronically being too friendly is not just a behavior pattern. It is a conditioning of the nervous system to avoid discomfort at the cost of authenticity. At the heart of this conditioning lies a dysregulation of the brain's stress responsor circuitry, particularly the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. This system is designed to activate in response to perceived threats and to return to baseline when the threat is gone. However, in individuals who rely on friendliness as a protective strategy, the HPA axis becomes sensitized not to direct threats, but to the potential of social disapproval, rejection, or interpersonal tension. This creates a hypervigilant baseline where the nervous system is constantly scanning the social environment for signs of conflict, disappointment, or emotional danger. This chronic overactivation alters cortisol rhythms, the hormone responsible for regulating stress and maintaining physiological balance. In a healthy system, cortisol spikes during acute stress and tapers off as the body returns to homeostasis. But when friendliness is used to preemptively manage perceived threats, Cortisol levels can remain subtly elevated throughout the day, even in seemingly neutral social situations. The brain and body begin to perceive social interaction itself as something that must be managed, controlled, or softened through performative behavior. Over time, this leads to emotional exhaustion, poor recovery from stress, and an overall reduction in resilience. You're not just tired from being nice, you're neurologically burned out from managing internal alarm signals that never get fully addressed. This cycle is further reinforced by the brain's predictive processing systems. The brain is constantly making predictions about what's likely to happen next based on past experience. For someone who has learned that being too direct, honest, or assertive leads to disconnection, discomfort, or even punishment, the brain encodes those outcomes as highly probable. So when the opportunity for authenticity arises, whether it's giving a real opinion, saying no, or showing emotional truth, the prediction system floods the body with anticipatory anxiety. This is not simply a psychological fear of being disliked. It is a neurological forecast that acting authentically is dangerous. The brain fires up the insular cortex, amygdala, and anterior cingulate cortex to prepare for social pain. This pain is anticipated before anything has even occurred, and the system is so averse to it that it instinctively chooses the safer path of excessive friendliness. What complicates this even more is the role of oxytocin, a neuropeptide often associated with bonding, empathy, and trust. Oxytocin can have dual effects. In safe, reciprocal relationships, it facilitates closeness and emotional openness. But in people who are chronically too friendly, oxytocin can actually heighten attachment even in asymmetrical or imbalanced relationships. The brain may release oxytocin in moments of approval, creating a biochemical reward for behavior that undermines personal boundaries. This fosters a loop in which friendliness is chemically linked to feelings of connection, even when that connection is not mutual or healthy. You may feel emotionally attached to people who don't truly see you, simply because the act of being friendly triggered your bonding system. At the same time, neuroplasticity ensures that whatever you practice repeatedly becomes embedded in the brain's structural wiring. If you habitually suppress your truth to be liked, if you reflexively smile through discomfort or agree to things that drain you, those pathways become dominant. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for inhibitory control, strengthens its suppression of authentic impulses. You don't just choose friendliness anymore. It becomes automatic. The brain's default wiring shifts to prioritize peacekeeping over self-expression. And because this response is embedded in the nervous system, it often feels involuntary. You smile without thinking. You accommodate without pausing. You say yes before your body has even had a chance to register whether that's what you want. The behavior becomes reflexive, driven by neural networks that were built through repetition and reinforced through biochemical relief.